In December of 361 AD, Flavius Claudius Julianus entered Constantinople as the unexpected sole emperor of the Roman world, a 30-year-old philosopher-king who had spent the previous decade pretending to be a Christian while privately offering midnight sacrifices to the sun god Helios. This emperor, known as Julian the Apostate, had roughly 20 months left to live. He didn't know that, and he attempted nothing less than the systematic reversal of 40 years of Constantinian religious policy. The central question that historians have wondered about this Julian was this: was he genuinely committed to a kind of pluralistic Roman Empire in which paganism could reassert itself? Or was Julian really intent upon enacting a more calculated strategy of cultural and institutional strangulation designed to break Christianity? We look at Julian the Apostate and his war on Christianity on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 93, Julian and the Pagan Counter-Revolution. So as I mentioned in the introduction there, my argument today is that Julian was a brilliant, ruthless, and terrifyingly sincere idealist. He consolidated power with impressive speed and sophistication, breathtaking really, and his religious program, that is, his revival of non-Christian, traditional Roman religion, tells us a lot about how entrenched Christianity had become. And when we left off, in the last episode, Julian had just found himself suddenly gifted the Roman Empire from his enemy, Constantius II. A delegation had arrived to Julian's military camp before he was able to fight the civil war. The delegation let Julian know that Constantius, on his deathbed, had designated Julian as his official successor. And the coincidence here is almost too perfect. It smells, in a sense, of propaganda, that maybe writers sympathetic to Julian later invented the idea that Julian was the legitimate successor to Constantius II. The result of Constantius's deathbed bequeathal of the empire to Julian was the evaporation of an imminent civil war. And Julian immediately also decided to cast aside the mask that he had worn since he was a child. He openly made sacrifices to traditional gods. He let his beard grow like a Greek philosopher like Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. And he began writing letters to his friends and to government officials, openly proclaiming his loyalty to the old gods. This is a letter that he wrote, for example, to his uncle, also called Julian, at the end of the year 361, quote, "But the sun, whom of all the gods I besought most earnestly to assist me, and sovereign Zeus also, bear me witness that never for a moment did I wish to slay Constantius, but rather I wished the contrary. Why then did I come? Because the gods expressly ordered me, and promised me safety if I obeyed them. But if I stayed, what I pray no god may do to me. Furthermore, I came because having been declared a public enemy, I meant to frighten him merely, and that our quarrel should result in intercourse on more friendly terms. But if we should have to decide the issue by battle, I meant to entrust the whole to fortune and to the gods, and so await whatever their clemency might decide." This is a pretty revealing letter. Here we have Julian openly proclaiming his loyalty to the god of the sun and to Zeus, but it also justifies his behavior against his own cousin and the reigning emperor Constantius. What Julian says he was really doing by marching an army east was just trying to scare old Constantius, threaten him enough into having a conversation, and maybe the two could figure things out. Now, what were they going to figure out? I don't know. Maybe some kind of co-emperor agreement, but that doesn't seem likely based on what we talked about in the last couple of episodes. So this is Julian probably making things up, but what he's not making up is his adherence to the gods. And as we'll see in this episode, Julian is very sincere on this point. So after writing this letter, he entered the city of Constantinople on the 11th of December, 361. And the city was already in mourning. Constantius's funeral procession had arrived, and Julian, in a stroke of genius, took up a posture of mourning. He helped carry the coffin in the procession to the Church of the Holy Apostles. This gesture obviously carried great emotional weight, as it seemed as though Julian really did mourn for Constantius, but it also was politically important because it suggested that there truly was continuity. The new emperor was escorting the old emperor to heaven, and what was occurring was not a coup, but a continuity. Once Constantius was buried, Julian began his program of religious change. Either at the end of that same year, 361, or maybe early in the next year, Julian established a special tribunal at Chalcedon, just across the Bosphorus from the capital, Constantinople. This was explicitly a military commission designed to investigate and punish alleged abuses under the previous emperor, Constantius II. Julian didn't actually preside over this thing himself, but he appointed his trusted Praetorian prefect of the East, and then under him was a panel of judges, at least a couple of whom were prominent holdovers from the inner circle of the previous emperor Constantius, and all of this was meant to show that this tribunal was going to be impartial, and it was aimed at reconciliation rather than being some kind of instrument of a political purge. In reality, the tribunal moved pretty quickly to condemn several notorious figures from the previous regime, some of whom we have already heard about, like Paulus the Chain, that torturer that went to the west of the empire about a decade earlier. Constantius's chamberlain, Eusebius, was also executed. The most controversial prosecution that the tribunal pursued was that of Ursulus. If you remember, Ursulus had supported Julian during his time in Gaul, and why he was killed is anyone's guess. It could be that some members of the army didn't care for him, and of course Julian, not being in charge of the proceedings himself, could claim that, well, he was just letting the justice system do its work impartially. Besides, Julian had other things on his mind, namely a sweeping set of administrative and fiscal reforms aimed at reducing the size and the cost of the imperial government while easing burdens on cities and taxpayers. What did these include? Drastically cutting the staff at the palace in Constantinople, reducing the number of imperial secret agents and messengers, restricting the use of the cursus publicus. This was the Roman state post system. So rather than let a bunch of different officials use it, only those given expressed permission could now use that system. Julian decided also to abolish compulsory crown payments. So Roman cities, whenever a new emperor took the throne or on anniversaries of that emperor's accession, had to provide money to the central government. Julian decided to abolish that. He also restored certain public lands, including temple properties that had been taken from Roman cities, allowing them to have those sites once again. And he also revoked the special status that Christian clergy had enjoyed since the days of Constantine, in which they did not have to participate in compulsory public services as city councilors. As we saw in previous episodes, the burden of the Roman Empire had grown greater and greater, and it was put on the backs of local elites, especially city councilors. And the only path of escape from those obligations was joining the church. But now that loophole in the system had been closed by Julian. So now wealthy clergy and their families had to once again provide expensive and time-consuming civic obligations that for 2 generations they had been shielded from. This looked to Christians like a deliberate attack on church finances. I'm sure that Julian was at least partially ideologically motivated. I don't think this was just a fiscal matter. Pagan intellectuals, however, who were coming out of the closet at this time probably in droves, were ecstatic with this. They saw Julian as a frugal and civic-minded emperor walking back some of the excesses of Christian favoritism. Then in 362, we start to get some of the more sweeping laws. One of Julian's first religious acts after reaching Constantinople was to issue a general edict of toleration. This was probably in February or so of 362 AD. What this amounted to was the large-scale reopening of pagan temples, the reinstitution and resumption of sacrifices, and the edict that he put out explicitly stated that no one, that's Christians and pagans, was to be compelled in matters of religion or subjected to violence. We know Julian's intentions because he actually wrote letters describing his views on the topic. In one of the letters, he says, quote, "I affirm by the gods that I do not wish the Galileans," that's his word for Christians, "to be either put to death or unjustly beaten or to suffer any other injury, but nevertheless I do assert absolutely that the God-fearing must be preferred to them. For through the folly of the Galileans, almost everything has been overturned, whereas through the grace of the gods we are all preserved. Wherefore we ought to honor the gods and the God-fearing, both men and cities." That's letter 37 of Julian. At the same time, Julian ordered the recall of all bishops who Constantius had exiled for various doctrinal reasons. Now, there were a few of these that were very prominent, like Athanasius, the fiercely anti-Arian bishop of Alexandria, who had been deposed and banished multiple times under Constantius. Now, the reason Julian gave for this was humanitarian, but the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was not a Christian and very much liked Julian, nevertheless was pretty blunt about what Julian actually wanted to do. Julian hoped that returning these exiles would inflame the already ferocious factional disputes within the church. And this is what Ammianus Marcellinus said. In order to give more effect to his intentions, he ordered the priests and different Christian sects, with the adherents of each sect, to be admitted into the palace, and in a constitutional spirit expressed his wish that their dissensions being appeased, each without any hindrance might fearlessly follow the religion he preferred. He did this more resolutely because as long license increased their dissensions, he thought he should never have to fear the unanimity of the common people, having found by experience that no wild beast are so hostile to men as Christian sects in general are to one another. So the strategy here is very straightforward. Christians had a tendency to fight. Christians were Julian's main opposition to his sweeping pagan reforms. So what better policy could there be for him than to bring all the Christians of these different ideas back into the fold all at once and have them all start talking to each other and fighting again? And thus they'll be too occupied with their petty partisan squabbles to worry about Julian's sweeping repaganization of the Roman Empire. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy. And this strategy got results. I mean, even before the edict was actually passed and Julian had been appointed emperor, that news alone was enough to embolden a violent backlash against Christians. For example, in Alexandria, there was an Arian bishop named George of Cappadocia. He had been very harsh in the way that he treated his political opponents, especially the followers of Athanasius, but also the pagan population, which was quite large in Alexandria. When Julian came to power, the population in Alexandria revolted against George of Cappadocia. He was lynched, his body was dragged through the streets and burned. Julian then wrote a letter to the people of Alexandria, which we have, rebuking them for taking the law into their own hands. But of course, this was exactly what Julian really wanted, and the violence became an excuse for him to confiscate George's library for his own use. Another way in which Julian was able to set back the Christianization of the empire was through a measure aimed at kind of long-term cultural change. In June of 362, Julian issued an edict requiring that all teachers of grammar and rhetoric in the cities of the Roman Empire be approved by their local councils and then personally confirmed by the emperor. In a letter that Julian wrote afterwards, we know what he was really trying to do. Quote, "Since the gods have granted us liberty, it seemed to me absurd that men should teach what they do not believe to be sound. If, however, they think that those writers were in error with respect to the most honored gods, then let them betake themselves to the churches of the Galileans to expound Matthew and Luke, since you Galileans are obeying them when you ordain that men shall refrain from temple worship." That's Julian's letter number 36. So what is he saying here? He's saying that Christians could not in good conscience teach the classics, Homer, Hesiod, Demosthenes, Herodotus, because Christians regarded the gods in those texts as false or even demonic. So it was hypocritical for those Christians to earn a living expounding literature that they believed to be based on religious lies. And so in this letter, he's saying that Christians should either accept the truth of the classics, that is, they should return to paganism, or they should just teach the Gospels in churches. This law was, in practice, a ban on Christian teachers. If you were a Christian, you could not teach the standard texts of a Greek and Roman education. And there were a lot of Christian teachers, and there were a lot of Christians educated in the classical approach. This was a law that struck at the very heart of educated Christian identity. Grammar and rhetoric, through the study of classical text, were indispensable as a foundation for elite status and for public careers. In the minds of Christians, Julian was trying to take away a crucial cultural and educational link between the new Christian empire and its ancient roots. And we don't know how rigorously this law was enforced, but we do know that some Christian teachers did resign. Several high-profile ones decided to give up their positions rather than apostatize. So in the end, I think the pattern here is pretty consistent. Julian brought pagan temples back into regular use. He taxed the church to do so. He stripped Christian clergy of their exemptions from civic duties. He tolerated and even maybe encouraged tacitly anti-Christian violence. He stoked internal Christian divisions and managed to do this without overt Christian persecution. Julian could never be pinned with the murder of Christians, for example. And so we could honestly say that his goal was persuasion, while the real effect of his laws was coercion. In the end, I think Julian is a pretty good example of how effective a sincere ideological autocrat could be if he believes that he has a divine mandate and can muster sufficient political will to enact sweeping, targeted reform. But as I hinted at in the beginning, Julian's program would be cut short. Just 18 months after he took over, Julian would die on a Persian battlefield. His reforms would be undone, and within a single generation, Christianity would triumph once and for all over the Roman Empire.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.